All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you, not live again. I'm with someone from the West Coast, and this person has been a part of, um, unfortunately, the social justice movement, or at least has been a victim of the social justice movement in the educational settings, in the primary kind of level education settings. And I think his story is going to be valuable for everyone. So I encourage you to really pay attention and listen for how a set of good ideas can be turned into a very, very dangerous and harmful thing. So without further delay, let's have a conversation about social justice and education.
Hi,
So,
Patrick. Thank you so much for doing this interview. It's a fantastic opportunity to talk about the subject that really means a lot to me and my family.
sure,
I think
absolutely.
your introduction was great. I think you know there's, we need to understand that there are certainly issues in our society and problems in our society that I think as compassionate human beings, we want corrected. We want everyone to be treated equally.
Mhm.
We want the criminal justice system to not you take a person's race into account for their outcomes and sentencing. We want all kids to be educated,
Mhm.
and have a good opportunity to be successful. We all live on the same land, and when we, learn to treat each other with respect, and we all benefit. On the other hand, certain ideologies that claim to be beneficial towards everyone are not necessarily benefiting anyone. I think in the end, my perspective on social justice is that it sort of legitimizes racial discrimination. When implemented into the school system, especially into the younger ages, it can be catastrophic towards the psychological health of the students, and that's sort of my big issue.
Yeah. Do you want to share about the experience you had that kind of led you to this view of social justice?
Yeah. My sort of case is I have a young daughter. She started school in kindergarten, and um, you know, I began noticing, probably as she got closer to, first and second grade, is that she, to me, she was depressed. She was very negative about herself,
Mhm.
and um, she just wasn't doing stuff that kids normally would do.
Yeah.
She wasn't laughing, she wasn't playing, she wasn't singing in the halls. No matter what activity we were doing, no matter how positive it was, she would sort of always like see the negative in it, and it's really hard as a parent to see that.
Mhm.
Because you want your child should be happy. And, when that's not happening, it's hard to know what to do.
Mhm. So you saw that she was becoming more so depressed, it sounds like.
Correct. Yes.
And then how long did you notice that going on? What was kind of the progression of things?
It was, sort of mild at, sort of into that first sort of second grade year, but it became, much worse. I was struggling to figure out why this was happening.
Mhm.
It didn't seem like it was coming from home.
Okay.
My relationship with her mom is really positive. We live together. I have another child that was doing well. We couldn't find any sort of obvious sources. Um,
Mhm.
and I just sort of, started trying to understand what was happening in her life. And, she started telling me about, some of the stuff that was going on at school. And sort of from this, it sort of became clear, that, the school was teaching their version of social justice. has this sort of underpinning of, oppressors and, people of color or victims.
Mm-hmm.
And they sort of reformatted that curriculum to sort of justify, this viewpoint, to prove that it was true.
Sure.
Unfortunately for kids, like the people who look like them doing negative things, it's sort of, they internalize this. My daughter sort of was asking her what she was learning at school, and she, started telling me about, certain historical figures. And she sort of came to this conclusion that, like people are mean.
Oh, really?
Like, why would you say that? And I think she sort of like, never per se told that by her teachers, but I think, story over story of,
Mm-hmm.
oppression by white people and people of color, like they come to their conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
You make kids feel that this is truth, by sort of always portraying things in a certain perspective.
Mm. So she came home and said, "Why are white people so mean?"
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And this is a first and second grade child.
So wow.
So I sort of started looking into this school, and I didn't understand how deep this went into the core sort of culture of the school. And I initially talked to the teachers, and they referred me to the family liaison, and she said, "Well, we're just doing this sort of change makers curriculum," and sort of blew it off like it wasn't like a negative thing. I'm like, you sort of are always portraying white people in a negative way. This is going to have ramifications. She's like, never really thought about it that way. Like, is there any way you could, this is what she's saying to me, but clearly this is not what she believed. So I said, can you sort of do this in a way where, people can learn and overcome adversity without, demonizing like a group of people? And she and sort of the lower school teacher, the lower school headmaster, said that that's what they're going to do. And, to me, that sort of seemed like, the issue was resolved. But, my daughter's behavior didn't sort of get any better. And I started, talking to the head of the school. I started attending school board meetings, and, learning more about what was happening at the school in terms of their ideological intention. And, they sort of tried to deny what they were doing. But eventually I got to the point where I did a public records request to, that they were teaching in some of the training. I was just crushed at, what I found out. You sort of expect that your teachers would be working on behalf of your children and, treat all kids with respect. But, this, what they call this, culturally responsive training. It was sort of the way they injected social justice into the school, and they called it anti-bias and anti-racist. But the truth, it was the opposite. That, they basically used this, like they had this is a training that had credentials and like academic, like citations and everything that, made it legitimate. But, made their racism, like what they were doing was trying to legitimize their racism. I've always asked myself, why teachers, why would they do this to their students? Why would they sort of accept this racism? Because most of them are good people who, I respect. But somehow to me, they were being hoodwinked into believing that this racism was legitimate. So one of the examples, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to clarify, when you say racism, you specifically mean anti-white racism?
Correct. I mean, to me, it's like, if you're racism against one person, you're probably racist against another. You have a mindset where you will take a person and decide that it's okay to, define who they are by the color of their skin.
Right.
But specifically, they had a lot of anti-white racism. If I can quote one of the definitions
Sure.
that they provided, here's how they define whites. As a socially created racial group, historically and currently receive the benefits of race in the United States. This category includes all the different ethnic groups of European origin, regardless of difference in their histories, ethnicities, or cultures. This is from a glossary called Anti-Bias Education for Young Children and Ourselves.
So that was regardless of histories? Is that what I heard?
Yes. I mean, they're literally dehumanizing people. I mean, this is what they're sort of, when you say that your histories are irrelevant and your personal story is irrelevant, that the only thing that matters to you, you completely defined by the color of your skin, that is racism, and that's dehumanizing people. That's what you would expected in, the 1940s, when the World War II was happening, and when military tried to demonize and dehumanize the other. That's sort of like mentality that's happening.
Yeah.
But for some reason, this was accepted, like in this school, like this was legitimate, that you could completely characterize a person by the color of the skin and nothing by it. And to me, this is horrifying. I mean, why does this have anything to do with kindergarten through sixth grade education?
Huh. Yeah, to me, I had a thought earlier when you were talking about this at first, and it seemed like, Barney the dinosaur had gotten steroids almost and again, I'm not speaking from any firsthand experience because I've never actually watched Barney the dinosaur, but what my regular childhood friends have told me is that, it's a very inclusive message of clean up everybody everywhere kind of thing. And like everyone's on the same playing field. Whereas this is beyond inclusive and now starting to exclude people based upon category membership.
Absolutely. I mean, this is an Orwellian nightmare where you use one term to mean something the opposite.
Uh-huh.
And, I always thought like I never understood what a offensive and, the opposite of defensive ideology. This is all these terms, they're used to show how to attack and be successful.
Yeah.
Like diversity or these other great terms. I mean, the basic idea, they're good concepts,
Mm-hmm.
but they use them as sort of weapons in order to sort of like, push their ideology into institutions.
Yeah. Wow. So we kind of got off the rails about the story about your daughter.
Yeah.
So how is it ending up with your daughter so far?
The good news is, I took her out of the school, and, like 3 months later, we were in our house, and, my daughter was like running down the hall, skipping, singing. Like I have not seen that for like 3 years.
Wow.
Like I just like at that moment, it struck me like I had my daughter back. Like this is who she's supposed to be. But this was taken away by the school. I'm happy that this happened, that we got over it, but like I just showed me what power the school is having over these children. The school ideologically, they like to talk about racial power dynamics is one of the terms that they use.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that one group has power over another,
Mm-hmm.
and that they, their moral authority is because they sort of try and advocate for the underdog, the powerless, and whatever they do is legitimized by that.
Mm-hmm.
But what they really don't understand is the ultimate powerlessness is children in a school.
Mm-hmm.
They're open-minded, and the school has so much legitimacy in terms of like what they're saying be truth, that kids take it in. So when they teach sort of this anti-white, white people or oppressor narrative, like
Mm-hmm.
children accept it as the truth, and then down to the core of their human being. This is probably something, you're a psychologist, I don't want to get out of my territory, but I think this is something that's going to affect these children for the rest of their life.
Yeah, I think it certainly could affect children for the rest of their life if they're taught maybe the most extreme form of this that it sounds like your daughter got, because again, these kids are very impressionable and they look up to adults as authority figures for the most part. So it's interesting if a teacher is telling a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old like your daughter, well, make sure you beware of white people because they have historically hurt lots of people and they probably still benefit from, hurting people the world over.
Yeah.
So I think that does leave an impact on people. Now, I think, to be fair, because I can hear people's rebuttals in my head already, which is, well, this is just one school, or this is just because it's on the West Coast and this is where kind of the more radically liberal people exist, etc. I mean, have you spoken with other people in other cities or states? I know this is all like, kind of ad hoc and.
I wish it was just my school. I wish it was no school, but
Sure.
I wish it was just my school. But unfortunately, this is happening across the U.S. I know in New York City, it's just it's a catastrophic racism going on in their Department of Education. I mean, just
Carranza,
blatant, the anti-colonialist, and we see the meltdown at Evergreen State University. And the Minnesota, they're sort of pushing this white privilege and other stuff. This is going on throughout the country, and I've always really wondered, why is this happening? Like, this is blatant racism. Why are our institutions not doing something about it, or why is no one having some common sense of, like, this is probably not healthy for our children. So, we filed a complaint to the Office for Civil Rights, the Department of Education. And I was, heartbroken at the response that they provided, that, I had spent approximately a year and a half just like gaining, like copying posters and all the emails between the county, Office of Education, and the school about this very biased recruiting program they were having, as well as like the training, which gave an example of, like, I had documented this stuff very well, and the OCR, refused to even investigate, which to me is frightening, but maybe it makes sense. And, like, this is going on in plain sight across the U.S., and I haven't seen any sort of pushback from the Office for Civil Rights. My initial thought was maybe no one was able to sort of verbalize what was going on, because the social justice movement, it's brilliant in the way that, like, it knows the psychology of people, in the way it introduces nice sounding things as nice sounding things, and it takes a long time to figure out what's really going on. So I hope that, maybe if I could create a narrative that explained what was happening, the truth of what was happening, not just the superficial explanation of it, that the OCR would act. Unfortunately, they chose not to. And then it sort of dawned on me is that, part of this ideology is about, taking over institutions. They want power. My friend, Carrie Smith, who was, really sort of into this ideology for years, she's like, they say that when someone dies, the RIP, we would normally say rest in peace. They say rest in power. Their ideology is all about power, gaining power, and then, viewing everything from the perspective of who has power and who doesn't. But, as I said before, I feel maybe that the OCR has been taken over by this ideology. I can't, to me, I can't find a good explanation. This is not just racism towards kids. This is at this sort of fundamental level, this is psychological abuse of these children. And how could the OCR not act? Like that's their job. Like if they have any job, it's to sort of address situations like this. We talk about like the OCR act if, there's some etching of, some sort of racist word or something on a desk. But this is sort of 1,000 times greater than that. I mean, this is a whole system that's sort of like exuding racism, and it's not acting.
Mm-hmm. Right. It seems like it's a system that's causing a power differential based upon ethnicity or race, and which is kind of the definition of systemic racism that
Correct.
the kind of classic social justice warrior would use. And just to put a fine point on the issue, if it were one school at one point, I think this would be a fairly unconcerning experience, but when you first contacted me about this, I think it was via Twitter, I can't think of a time in the last 3 years where I haven't heard a story, something like this. And it's fascinating because I think the problem that you and I are seeing here is because we're on the coast specifically, we are going to get the most rapid and the most, let's say, foolish implementation of policies like this because it's a fairly liberal area where we both live. And it seems to me like, if you were to probably scale this back to 10 years ago and think about how to do this more mindfully and more thoughtfully, then this probably would never have happened because I think people would have come to their senses about how to deal with issues of social justice, right? I can't, me personally, I still think that there's a home for critical theory and critical race theory and things of that nature that perpetuate this educational social justice stuff. I really do, because I know that there's a need for a counter reaction to historical oppression. I think that there's a perfectly, let's say, logical reason why any group would want a counter reaction to having been out of power for so long. I don't see that as sick or weird at all. I think the problem is that there's a lot of kind of false flags and things of that nature that show up where now we have to really fight racism because, we've got the upper hand now, or we've got a voice now, and every little thing is used as an excuse to kind of keep pushing a power narrative to compensate for the past. So that I find
Correct.
problematic. I don't find it
Yeah.
problematic that they want power, that any group wants power. Like historically, Asian groups in the United States have been oppressed horrifically in terms of building railroads and internment during World War II, etc. Horrific things have happened, right? And I can perfectly see why any group of people who's been oppressed by a dominant group would want power and maybe even overcorrect a little bit, because it seems like that's what happens in history is there's one group that has power, the other group that's opposing it comes back and gets power and then overcorrects a little bit, and then we kind of go back and forth overcorrecting. So to me, it seems like an overcorrection moment that we're in for the last 10 years,
Correct. I mean, I think there's a certain point where this just becomes about vengeance.
Sure.
And, they feel that, any sort of horror is justified, because of history. But, there's this at a certain point, like, when are you the monster that you say that you're fighting against? And I think if they're attacking these children, then they have become that monster. They treat these children like they're guilty, that they're criminals, because of history that, these children literally had nothing to do with. They may have, somehow they came about to who they are, but you don't have no one has a right to attack truly innocent people.
Mm,
But that's what's happening,
mm,
especially when they go after, young children. Um,
mm.
you know, Once again, you have a legitimacy of problems, historical problems, but you're not solving those historical problems. You're just changing them around and changing the figures, but we're doing the same sort of evil that you complained about in the past.
Yeah, it seems like that, doesn't it? And I find myself very confused as to kind of the end game for the various people operating in this social justice space, because I think it's a diverse group of people. I don't think all of them are radicals. I'd say it probably maps onto the idea that kind of political radicals are 8% of the population on the left and the right. So I would assume it's kind of the same thing in the kind of social justice sphere, that the vast majority of people who believe in social justice are not that noisy 8%, but it's just the noisy 8% can do a lot of damage and are also just very noisy. So we pay attention to it. It's scary because it's noisy, you know?
Correct.
So I
Yeah.
think that, you go ahead.
I think social justice markets itself really well. And I think you have good people wanting to do the right thing, who think they're doing the right thing, but they're sort of, because of the way social justice is, they're blind to the crimes that it commits.
Mm,
Because if you bring them up, you'll get swatted away.
mm,
They don't like apostates, or they don't like
mm,
any sort of examples that show that there's hypocrisy.
mm,
So when people aren't sort of thinking critically about it, they're basically told what to think. I don't know if you read, there was an article in the Post Millennial about the psychology of cults and social justice.
mm.
And sort of it's designed to sort of take over people's minds just like a cult would. It's designed to isolate you and control you, not necessarily to. It's certainly not designed to make you critical of the ideology itself, or allow you to sort of think critically about it.
And I would say that this is where maybe having a very specific definition of terms would be useful, because again, I can see the necessity for something called social justice. I see no
Mhm.
problem with that on its face, academically, etc. What I see, or how I would split hairs here, is I would say that it's kind of, I think the popular phrase that a lot of people use is like woke religion. So
Yeah.
I would say that there are factions of the social justice movement that are doing very useful things, and then that loud, noisy, gross Antifa like 8% of the social justice movement is part of the woke religion, that they're kind of very dichotomous in their thinking. They're very easily self-deceived, like most religious people are. They're perfectly okay with logical fallacies that they enact, all that typical religious thinking stuff that's very dogmatic, right? I would say the woke part is the religious dogmatic part, but I think the social justice part, technically speaking, is unproblematic as a broad kind of construct. I don't know if you,
Maybe.
I don't know if you'd agree with that or not.
Yeah. Once again, like just because something has noble goals,
Hmm.
it doesn't mean it's necessarily the right vehicle to achieve those goals.
Okay.
Like, like, is there another way, that we could approach, making sure that people did have a good opportunity or true educational equality, like, without sort of embarking uh, on the mechanisms of social justice, which sort of forces itself in a more authoritarian way.
Hmm.
Just like the Black Panthers. Everyone sort of, especially realists, they're sort of thought of as demigods, because they use violence, or
Hmm.
threaten violence. But have we sort of asked ourselves the question, if they didn't threaten violence, if they sort of were more peaceful, would things have turned out differently? Would we have made more successful civil rights advances? Without sort of this threatening component of it.
You mean like
I
the
don't
Martin
know.
Luther King type of,
Correct. Yeah.
peaceful protest, etc.?
exactly. Because I mean, I think if Martin Luther King, his great idea, like if you can change a person's mind, if you can show them real truth and the real humanity, like people believe that,
Uh-huh.
and and like that's a great way to like change whole societies with having great thoughts. But when
Mm-hmm.
you threaten people, when you use this authoritarian, tyrannical um, way to advocate for your position, it creates this defensiveness
Mm.
on your opponent, and ultimately, I don't know that it achieves its goal any faster.
Mm-hmm.
Using violence or threats of violence. Is social justice doing the same way, where they have certain goals that most people would agree with, but just like in my case, where I see it and I just have a little PTSD about it because I know
Mm-hmm.
the horrors of what they
Mm-hmm.
can do to people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard for me to support at least their vision of it.
Right.
Um, you know,
Yeah, I think that's perfectly understandable. I mean, you've experienced something that I think any parent would have a kind of emotional scar about, seeing your daughter, not to use a dramatic word, but kind of decompensate a little bit compared to her
yeah,
normal functioning for years on end and become more depressed and more joyless as a little kid, when, that's kind of the time in life when you're supposed to be kind of full of joy, is when you're young and
yeah,
naive and you don't know anything. And, that's kind of the goal, is to have fun and be creative and learn and play. And if school is teaching you that the world is a cruel, oppressive game, kind of the very Jordan Peterson look at life, then that's going to be very hard for kids, I think.
yeah.
And as a
I
parent,
mean,
I'm sure that's terrible for you to watch.
yeah. I mean, does anyone benefit from this? I mean, like, we all live in the same country, and we need to work together. But we need to see each other as human beings, as individuals. But when schools are teaching that, they're adding this extra space, this extra dimension between people, of
Mm-hmm.
this, this ideology sort of says you have to look at this person as being this certain identity or these multiple identities. We're not seeing each other anymore. We're seeing
Group
that
identity.
group identity, the stick medium that distracts us from seeing each other as
Right.
individuals, which is sad. Like to me, like the relationships I benefit most are, when I can really sort of have a good conversation, understand someone else. Um,
Mm.
I feel that those are the most beneficial relationships for me and that person.
Mm-hmm.
But if schools have sort of embarked on teaching people not to see each other as individuals, then it's easy to sort of dehumanize people or to not see their true value. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they are teaching the racism that they pretend, to be against. What's the end game of this?
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Right. That's a good question. I think that would be a wise one to try to answer, because kind of scrolling back to your earlier point, I wonder if this is actually helping people be more collaborative and interactive or not. So, like, for instance, the research that I'm aware of, and again, this is not my expertise or anything, so I may be missing updated research, but my understanding is, at least, the one kind of like anti-racism intervention that seems to work really well for adults and kids is just increased intergroup contact. And
Exactly.
and what's fascinating to me is, I think, working on the hypothesis that you put forward so far, and based upon your daughter's experience especially, if kids are walking away from this training, this, culturally responsive training or whatever it is, and they're getting this sense that, well, this group is bad, is that going to make them want to go increase intergroup contact, or is that going to make them want to kind of think twice about talking to a white kid, or think twice about talking to a black kid or an Asian kid or a Hispanic kid or whatever, you know? So I think
Yeah.
that's a really cool testable hypothesis. Do kids in schools with culturally responsive teaching or whatever other curriculum like that, do they actually increase the number of minutes that they play with other races on the playground and spend time making friends? You know what I mean? Like, does that actually pan out in a way that's kind of observable, measurable, replicable, reliable. Because if it does, then keep doing it, I say. I think if it's really the truth that increased contact with people who look and sound different is what actually helps defeat bias and manage quote unquote implicit bias, and this actually works, let's keep doing it. But I don't know of any research that actually proves that point.
Or maybe it proves the opposite point, if there was any. But
Right.
unfortunately, with sort of the academic holds and the holdover sociology, that nothing, like any sort of research that pointed that this was counterproductive, I think would be hidden, or the researchers would be canceled out.
It's possible.
And that's why, like, this is, to me, it's such a tyrannical situation where it will never let itself be viewed in a negative way. Like, the ends always justifies the means for this, no matter how counterproductive it is. It only cares about its own survival as a culture.
It's like a virus.
Yeah. Some people call this a mind virus. Very accurate description.
That's funny, because that's exactly what I think Richard Dawkins used to call religion, is a mind virus.
Yeah.
It's weird.
I sort of do have to say something.
Sure.
I have to be a little bit careful. I know when I interact with a lot of people on a daily basis, different ages, different races, different cultures. I can say that, it's very easy for me to interact with, older people of any race, in terms of having good eye contact, good communication. And I think it's easier to have a sense of trust, which is really important. But I noticed that a lot of younger people, especially, when they sort of put the moniker of a person of color on, they have poor eye contact, and there's this assumption that, that you're doing stuff not out of their interest, that you're doing stuff, to sort of hold your authority over them and oppress them, and, which is sort of catastrophic as a society where, there's so many decent people, like, working because they love their want to help their fellow human being, but people of color are being taught that that's not the goal of white people, and it's so counterproductive. What's going to happen when these people get older and older, and and these stereotypes keep on getting reinforced by the social justice movement?
That's a good question. I would be very curious as to what the actual real world consequences will be 10 years from now and 20 years from now about these movements, because I think it's like most people who have a good idea or a good intention. What's that phrase? The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right?
Yes.
And I think that's exactly what we're running into here. Is we're running into a time where a lot of people with very good intentions, which I think are just short-sighted or maybe like medium long-term sighted, but they're not like long-term sighted, because I don't buy the kind of full conspiracy theory that the anti-social justice people, the strongest advocates of that, put out, which is, this is kind of a by design kind of takeover of education and academia and things of that nature. I don't think it's some kind of conscious, like, Stalinist movement. I don't see that at all. I see this as a bunch of, and my experience, and again, I can only speak to my experience. My experience is, especially teaching at a university, is I don't see any professor that I work with, and I don't see any student, essentially. I think I've run into one legitimate social justice warrior student in my time teaching, and in dealing with students, and even just people in Los Angeles where I live more broadly. I've never run into someone who really fully believed that the patriarchy was destroying the world and that, this social justice movement needed to take over, so to speak. I'll give you a quick, for instance, one of the new textbooks I'm using for a course I'm teaching this semester has words like epistemology all throughout it, and it's a book on family therapy assessment. So there's almost literally no need for that word to be in there, but it's kind of it's a woke-ish kind of textbook in that way. Now, the professor who's part of the department head and all that stuff, who's running the show, is not advocating this book because there's some kind of social justice warrior person. She's a very lovely individual, and there's no part of her that's ever said anything remotely kind of woke or anything of that nature. It's a modern textbook with modern ideas was the kind of the intention. So it's like the wokeness, so to speak, is just being backdoored in to academic discussion. It's not being intentionally by design shoved in by administrators. So there's no administrator in the psych department that's saying, well, you have to use this text because it's got, all this power and oppression kind of ideology in it. There's no one doing that.
I don't know if that's accurate. Have you seen the textbooks in Seattle where they sort of view math as an extension of white superiority? How could you not? To me, that seems like an example of like how this is being institutionalized. It's the institution that intends to push this.
Sure. I don't think it's that the institutions themselves are woke. I think it's that out of fear, specifically, that they are adopting these ideas so that there's no censure and then they're never, ever going to be accused of being some version of prejudiced again. That's kind of what I see it as. I don't see it as this kind of Machiavellian, like, this is the best way of operating, and if we don't do this, then our overlords are going to destroy us. I don't see it like that. I see it as kind of a cowardice thing, where they're not willing. It's two things. It's laziness and it's cowardice, where they're afraid to kind of look at alternative viewpoints and different ways of dealing with racism and bias. That's the first part, because this is the trending ideology. And then that's the second part, is the laziness. It takes no more than 5 minutes of Google scholaring anything to find all the research that shows what actually helps defeat racism and bias. Any administrator, if you have a master's degree in education or psychology or something of that nature, and you don't know how to read a peer-reviewed article, even a qualitative study, if you don't know how to read that, shame on you. You shouldn't be working, in my opinion. And it's just laziness. It's flat out intellectual laziness that keeps people from really looking at these ideas critically, which is the joke of this whole thing is, and this is my rant that I'm going to talk about at the upcoming Heterodoxy and Psychology Conference, is this was once a very critical, thoughtful way of looking at issues of power, race, oppression, blah, 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 blah. And it's gone from being thoughtful and critical to unself-critical, which is insane, because that is not what the original critical theorists in 1930s Germany were talking about. That is not at all what this was about. And then it just slowly morphed over the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s into a more transformative lens of aggression and power grabbing, as opposed to power examining and challenging.
Correct.
So that's the thing. I see it as laziness and fear, not some kind of Machiavellian, like, sociopathic takeover. That's my take, at least.
I mean, I think it's certainly I think it's a mix of both, where, some people use it to extend their own power and sort of more authoritarian. I agree. Some people probably, are motivated by fear and laziness. It's probably a combination. Unfortunately, it's having really negative consequences.
Sure.
I just, as a side, like, it, at least in our area, in the psychologic field, the mental health field, it is so pervasive that, my family's sort of struggling to figure out how to deal with the consequences of it. And, you can't find providers who don't centralize social justice in their therapy.
Hmm.
To me, that's
yeah.
catastrophic. Like, where are we supposed to turn for help?
And my hope would be
that,
that's a regionally specific thing as of right now.
Yeah, I hope so. But the schools, I think, yeah, you would know more than me because you're sort of more in the academic section. But I think a lot of the social workers, that so ingrained into their educational system that they're everywhere, and they're pushing it, and they have trouble understanding people who don't support social justice.
Yeah, I could see it being a bigger problem in school psychology and social work for sure, because those are more education-oriented disciplines and less scientific disciplines for sure. Educational psych is basically education with a couple of psychology theories thrown into it, so it's not really science per se.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I think it's a problem, and I think it's a growing problem. I just don't know that it's reached the critical mass point yet, and I guess the goal would be to minimize the noisy 8%, and not outshout them, because that doesn't work either. See, that's the thing I find problematic about the classic, IDW or anti-SJW crowd, is that they're going to try and outshout these people, and they're not going to win simply because they cannot play the victim role, and they will never be able to appeal to emotion in the same way that people of oppressed groups can. And because we're not intellectual creatures, we're emotionally creatures first, you cannot outshout these people. The only way to resolve and compromise in a healthy way, from what I can tell, is to actually have civil conversation as much as humanly possible, and to box out the people who are yelling and nasty by just growing the group of people that's willing to have civil discourse.
You're absolutely right. Like, I think, unfortunately, civil discourse is people. If you try and look, I spent a year and a half trying to talk with the school, after seeing the negative consequences, and I was shouted out and attacked and called bigot or whatever. I'm just trying to defend my daughter, and they don't want to have a conversation, at least in the school setting. What's there left to do?
Right.
There was a couple people who would at least talk, and I appreciated that, and I really respect them for it. But in general, if you stand up against this, you will be attacked, and it's hard for people to do the right thing in the situation, have that discourse, because I think we'll all benefit from discourse.
Sure. And I can completely understand why, the Jordan Petersons of the world do get feisty, and all the IDW people get feisty, because it's a necessity they see to fight back when they feel like they're being attacked. And if they don't fight back, then that shows weakness. And back to the point of the Martin Luther King approach, I think it's imperative to kind of be your word in these moments. So if you're part of the anti-social justice spectrum of any kind, right, you could be the most kind of Jordan Peterson or the most tepid version of anti-social justice with just some mild concerns. I think the most important thing is adopting that kind of peaceful protest and civil discourse attitude, because if people just fight back in kind, then it will only be, in my opinion, more conflict. It perpetuates the conflict.
Yeah.
I really think that's the case.
Did you read a book, How to Have Impossible Conversations, by Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay? I think they come to this conclusion as well, that attacking each other, and it just turns people off, and they become defensive, and they stop having, the conversations that actually produce like the connection between people.
Mm-hmm.
I think they sort of presented a couple of strategies, effective strategies of how we can get there.
Mm-hmm.
I think I wish that idea. I mean, sort of to piggyback on your idea, like you can't fight this fire with fire. It's going to burn our house down.
Right.
We need to find that the way that wins people's hearts, so they understand the reality of social justice, the negative reality as well as the positive things that it's doing, and somehow we need to sort out the positives and get rid of the negatives.
Absolutely. And, there's this, not to give away too many tricks of psychotherapy, but there's this theory called motivational interviewing, which allows people the opportunity to see a problem behavior differently and then develop intrinsic motivation to change their behavior that's problematic. So drug use, sexual behavior, overeating, whatever it is. And one of the most effective interventions or tools or tricks, I use the word trick because I clearly think of psychotherapy as just tricking people. I would say the most effective trick is this thing called decisional balancing. And decisional balancing is very simple. You say, okay, X and X person, you really, really like using heroin. So tell me about the pros and cons of using heroin, and then tell me about the pros and cons of not using heroin. Not just the cons, the pros of using and the pros of not using. Because if you just look at the consequences, if you just make the negative pitch and you kind of stiff arm them with a negativity, then they're going to be more resistant. The one trick that I think is going to help people really win this culture war, if you want to call it that, is decisional balancing with people all day, every day. That's the one reason why I think I've been so successful on Twitter, is I basically use that skill all day, every day with people who disagree with me. There's no part of me that goes at them with, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong.
Correct, yeah.
So I think that might be a trick we should all do more of.
I agree. There's a couple of people I've seen, and the ones who are effective of pushing opposite view are not the people who attack, but they say, hey, there's some legitimacy in this viewpoint, and but there's some sort of contradiction or hypocrisy of it as well. And, those people you'll have that conversations with, a discussion with, and to come out the better person on the other side.
Sure. That's the hope, at least. Yeah. Well, this has been quite a chat. Do you want to wrap up with anything specific that, a message or a hope, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, my central goal is I have two viewpoints. Like, talking to, one of the people at the school, I asked her, why are you doing this? She's like, well, as a girl, I didn't see many pictures of myself, and, it made me feel bad. And, I completely get that. But like, I wouldn't want anyone to gone through the experience that I've had or my family has had. Part of our goal as being adults is not repeating, the abuses of the past. It's sort of learning from them and breaking this cycle. Like, like, how much it hurts you. Why would you allow the system to hurt someone else? Like that. Like, that's why, like, I can't buy into what social justice is, because as a caring person, like, don't hurt anyone else. You know how much it hurts. Why would you do this? Like what kind of person are you to do this? Like, I'm not explaining this very well, but like, I think social justice plays on the compassion of people, and that's how it motivates that. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're truly compassionate, then, don't use this, don't weaponize this, to attack people, which is exactly what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, be better, like, know how it hurts people and never allow people to get hurt again. Like, you have that power, like,
Yeah, I completely agree. Teachers have so much power to help kids develop new attitudes to not hurt people unnecessarily and to not be biased and not be racist. And I think the well-meaningness that started this movement is quickly dissipating and now hurting people. So I can definitely see how there are more and more cases of this showing up. And I really do appreciate you telling us the story about your daughter who, a 3-year progression of feeling worse and worse and worse and more depressed. And, that's really sad to see and hear about. When you first told me, I kind of was unfortunately not that surprised, but surprised still, that it was someone so young who was affected so dramatically. So I'd really appreciate you sharing about that, because I think more people need to hear that there are people who do get hurt by this. It's not just a set of ideas.
Exactly. There's real life consequences to religiously
Mm-hmm.
embracing this ideology, because no one knows. Like, this is something new. Like, this is it's just spreading like wildfire, and no one knows what. I mean, we should be studying stuff and understanding it, understand the consequences. I think, as you sort of like you do professionally, but they're not doing it. They're just like, it's just taking this ideology and instantly implementing it.
Yeah.
And I think recklessly implementing it.
Right.
Think of it. And I encourage you. I want you. I appreciate people like you who are open-minded and see it from both sides, and and hopefully your centrality will gain more and more moral authority to make all sides ask critical questions about their behaviors and actions.
That's my hope too. My hope is that we can take a healthy skepticism towards whatever ideology that suits us or resonates with us, because if it resonates with us, then it certainly doesn't resonate with other people. And that's just a matter of just how we're built. So if we can be healthily skeptical of things, I think we will all be better off. And I think hearing stories like the one with your daughter and your efforts for years to try and figure this out and make it right are pretty telling about kind of what I would hope are the edge cases, but you never know. So I really do appreciate you kind of sharing this with us.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Well, you have a good day, and we will hopefully chat again soon.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.